Tribalism is perhaps one of the most misunderstood concepts in the modern world, and upon these misunderstandings are built strong assumptions about the role that tribalism plays in our politics and the role that it also plays in how we view ourselves as human beings. And unfortunately, my friends, these misunderstandings have led to justifications of petty divisions. They've led to justifications of antagonism in our society, and they've also led to justifications of a gross misunderstanding of human nature. And in order to ensure that we can have a healthy political order, that we can have a strong society, and most importantly, that we can continue to create a civilization of rightly ordered men and women, we must understand tribalism for what it is and get rid of any illusions that we have of it. So in this video, my friends, I will actually be explaining why tribalism, contrary to the popular opinion, is not inescapable. It is not a absolute fact of human nature that overtakes everything else. And there are ways for us, as members of a society, as members of civilization, to overcome it in its forms. But before we get into that, my friends, I hope all of you are doing well. I am Christian Moss. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure this channel is successful and that this project is successful. My friend, this is a civic conservative project. If you believe in your heart that the inherent philosophical character of the American founding and of American civilization by extension is worth preserving and defending and pushing forth into the public discourse today, this is the channel for you. If you believe that America deserves better defenders that will, with a combination of moral clarity and philosophical rigor, attack the assumptions, the incorrect assumptions made by her enemies, this is the channel for you. Thank you guys so much for being here, and thank you for coming to think through this issue with me. Now, please enjoy the video. So, when we talk about tribalism these days, it's oftentimes talked about as the necessary state of things because it is derived from, in the view of so many other people, the nature of humans, human nature. And it is oftentimes, this assumption is used to justify things like the existence of political parties squabbling, things like certain groups viewing themselves in terms of superficial characteristics like identity features, and then characterizing other people as members of other groups with those characteristics. And it has even been used to justify antagonism as a means of understanding political order. The so-called friend-enemy distinction that has been so often talked about these days is essentially an attempt to justify tribalism to be a mode of understanding and ordering how government should work. And by the way, I've got a video on the friend-enemy distinction coming out very soon. It's a very complex issue that I think gets a lot wrong, but needless to say, I digress. But I don't think that these assumptions and these arguments actually consider human nature in its greatest and grandest form. And I also don't think that these arguments also consider the various components of man that make him man and how they interact with society. And so to actually address these misunderstandings, I will go to the source and foundation for all moral consideration and all philosophical consideration as it relates to humanity, and that is human nature. And by a very quick examination of human nature, we will be able to actually characterize and categorize tribalism in its proper form, and then understand it how it should be understood, not how it is understood by those who wish to give it a much bigger significance than it actually does play in our society. We should probably just begin by addressing the argument that tribalism is just human nature. This argument assumes a few things, my friends. Number one, this argument assumes that the whole of man's social impulse is consumed by tribalism. And now this will actually be pretty significant in a moment when I get to it. Then the implication of this assumption is that tribalism is inescapable because one cannot escape human nature. Now, if the first assumption is incorrect, the second assumption cannot possibly be true. So this then leads us to an investigation of man's social nature. So there are three components of human nature, my friends, that make up what it is to be a human, and most importantly, when these are harmonized, make up what it is to be a rightly ordered person. There is the rational. Man is a rational animal, but he's not just a rational animal, he's a social animal. But he's not just a social animal, he is a sentimental animal. Now, the danger of separating any of these categories into their own silos when talking about human nature and how our conduct is informed by them is quite evident. I'll demonstrate it right now. If you were to consider man solely as a sentimental animal, you would consider him in a way where he could be tyrannized by his passions and emotions with no check from any kind of logical impulse. If you were to then consider man solely as a social animal, you're considering him in a way where he does not have the ability to self-govern because he lacks self-ownership. If man lacks self-ownership, he cannot possibly govern himself and rightly order his sentiments according to any standard, much less reason. And if you consider man solely as a rational animal, he becomes this cold, calculating automaton, this robot who could easily retreat from the very facts of human motivation, that our affections influence us or that our social engagements influence us, and instead go into these far off places where his imagination guides him and he justifies anything by virtue of what makes sense to his reason. Reason unmoored from our social impulse, reason unmoored from sentiments, becomes a tool of destruction, and it becomes a tool of distortion because it can no longer clarify, it creates. Reason alone does nothing, but reason acting upon the observable world actually gives us the ability to understand it and to handle things more than if it existed in a vacuum. None of these things exist in a vacuum. So, to have a rightly ordered person, his sentimental nature, his social nature, and his rational nature must be in conjunction with each other, and these work towards a healthy human being. Now, tribalism is actually one subset of man's social nature. It's not even the entirety of man's social nature, it's one subset of man's social nature. Because as Cicero tells us in his great work on obligation, tribalism, human fellowship, human interaction exists on three levels. It exists on first the level of the country, the nation. So we are not just citizens, we are members of a nation. That's the grand level. But then we go down and there's a level of the community. So we're not just members of a nation, we're not just Americans, but we're also perhaps like we're Pennsylvanians or we're Georgians or we're Texans, right? You're not just British, perhaps you're Welsh, perhaps you're all kind of different things, right? You're not just in the UK, perhaps you're Scottish or Irish, Highland, Lowland, whatever exactly. These are the finer distinctions that come. Then we pull down to the more intimate level, our neighborhood, our neighbors, our family. So we're not just a citizen of a nation or a member of a community or a member of a state. We're also actually husbands, wives, daughters, sons. We are all the other things that make up our social engagements. So tribalism actually solely exists on this first level, because this is the level in which man begins to identify himself with his surroundings. Tribalism is fundamentally a concept that talks about man's surroundings and how we identify with them. This is how you get into the whole idea, for example, of opposing sports teams. It is very easy for someone to have a favorite sports team, then go to a sports game and go to the side where the other supporters of their team are playing and identify with them because it has proximity to him. And this is one of the ways I think we can easily see that tribalism does not constitute the whole of man's social nature, nor is it this deterministic part of his nature that will necessarily lead him to liking and preferring the group over preferring greater values or greater principles or other kinds of social impulse. Because tribalism, when you escape the first level of human interaction, or rather the third level of human interaction, when you escape proximity, tribalism's hold over the person breaks down. And if you can't sustain that connection beyond proximity, and if once you leave proximity that hold breaks down, it cannot possibly mean very much to you beyond that particular place, because man does not simply exist in an insular society. He exists in a society that is interactive, that has many different parts, where there are many different people, many different tribes, many different communities that he has to also account for outside of his own tribe. And this is the problem. The perspective that assumes that tribalism is inescapable is the perspective that cannot satisfy the obligations that moral duty puts upon us outside of the proximity that we exist in any particular moment. When you move away from the tribe and you interact with other people, how in the world are you able to do that if tribalism is the default mode? Something else has to be there, and that is our duties as members of a society, and that is more generally, going back up to the top level of the social impulse, the law of sociability. Sociability is this desire, this drive for man to enter into interaction with other people, and this produces society. And then a wise apportionment of this interaction goes ahead and produces civilization. So that then bleeds down and ultimately creates smaller clustered groups, which we would call tribes. But this view of tribalism flattens human nature to the level of the clustered group and ignores sociability beyond that. Again, it binds us to proximity, and by binding us to proximity, it makes it impossible for us to be citizens, because for us to be citizens, we must have general moral values at hand. We must have a fidelity which fosters a loyalty and a good faith between us and the institutions of society, and us and those who exist in society, even those who are beyond our tribe. For us to be citizens, we must be just, which is going to be that rule that ensures that our hands are tied from harming someone without due cause, that our hands are tied from destroying someone's property, that our hands are tied from stealing, that our hands are tied from destroying our promises through deceit. If we're going to be citizens, we have to have veracity, which is that principle of truth that makes it possible for us to even operate or even know and categorize what a tribe is in the first place. And therefore, if you're going to flatten human nature, you remove every single principle that is required for us to be able to exist in society. And therefore, the conversation is no longer about tribalism. The conversation is now about how does man even survive in a world where the requirements for social interaction are obliterated from the offset due to an incorrect perception about his social nature. And that is the crisis we went into right now. When it comes to the issue of tribalism, it binds us to proximity. But it also does something else. So not only does it bind us to proximity, it flattens human nature into a subset of the subset. So if man is social, he's not just social in the tribal arrangement, but he's also social outside of that as well. And simplified views of man's nature that reject what he is and instead create him into what he is desired to be or what he is expected to be by a vain imagination cannot serve us any good in actually understanding why things happen in our society, who man is, what influences his conduct, and what our standards ought to be for political order. And then, as I mentioned, if we have to move beyond proximity in order to understand our moral duties in the broader context of society and our social impulse, that then therefore means that tribalism itself has no moral force. Tribalism itself has no moral force. Because our obligations to the tribe, our obligations to those who are closest to us by proximity, are merely derivative of our broader obligations, those principles that constitute our broader obligations to other people in society. How can a derivative thing have power over the whole thing? How can something that is derivative direct us when there's a waterhead, a source from which that comes from? But also, let's assume that tribalism was, again, the default state of human nature. Let's assume that all of these things were true. How in the world can we account for personal responsibility? Because under this deterministic view of tribalism, we are, by our default, naturally and supposedly in the throes of our group, so to speak, regardless of what that group is. But in the absence of choice, moral responsibility is impossible. Moral responsibility is the result, the relationship between action and how that action connects with an effect. And moral relationships imply a level of choice. Otherwise, it would be impossible to be just, and it would be impossible to have fidelity. So the truth is, my friends, before we are tribal, before we are anything, we are social, and our social instinct is general. Our social instinct is not provincial. It is not tied down to a particular area, although it becomes that way eventually. But it only becomes that way because we have a starting point which is bigger than that to move from. So tribalism is not inescapable. Tribalism is simply a refusal to look beyond the tunnel vision of a subset of man's social nature, and then also to understand the social nature in the context of the rest of his nature. You can't sustain a civilization off of tribal affiliation. You can only sustain a civilization off of an adherence to first principles, goodwill and duty, and then a transmission of those principles towards people who are in other groups or have other affiliations than you do. So let's bring this to our political state at this point. When it comes to being a Democrat or Republican, when it comes to, having all these, being left on the left or right, when it comes to all these different things, when it comes to feeling pride in your race, which these are all forms of tribalism and in a sense, when it comes to these things, we should remember something, that oftentimes when we zoom out beyond our proximity, the picture becomes clearer and the assumptions that we can draw become clearer. But if we zoom into our proximity and we believe that it constitutes the whole world that we exist in, the whole social world and moral world that we exist in, we will always be led to believe false conclusions like that tribalism must be the necessary state of our society, of our lives. And this is just not true. We have to endorse an enlightened framework of moral education that says that the civic bond, that the social civic bond is far greater, far more impactful, and far more foundational than any tribal bond. And the tribal bond exists for a reason, believe you me, but it does not exist as man's default or as man's inherent state. It exists as a result of our default and inherent state, and that is our nature as social, sentimental, and rational creatures. When we understand this, my friends, the problem of tribalism and the problem of, and these arguments, these specious arguments made about how tribalism is inescapable, will no longer be problems, and we will instead be able to excavate our way to a solution and build our way towards a better kind of civilization. America was not founded on tribalism. America was founded upon a notion of cooperation and goodwill amongst various different tribes, which then melded together and formed the civilization that we now have the pleasure and the joy of living in. And we can continue that 1776 tradition of civic building and moral architecture building and using that to create better government and better society if we don't allow our surroundings to dictate our understanding of the truth. And I believe that we have the ability to transcend that provincialist mindset if we simply apply our minds to it. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to ensure this channel is successful. If the ideas you heard in this video inspired you and enchanted your mind, I would encourage you to join the Pensive cohort. It is my group of young thinkers who will be studying philosophy, studying moral ideas, and studying the history of America, then going into the discourse and defending our country from its foes, and also engaging in civic repair in our own ways. My friends, donate to me if you wish to help me as well. Helps me a lot. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.